The original Northeast Corridor route connecting New York to Washington, D.C. was the longest point and, depending upon your standards, still America's only high-speed railroad line. Its development, especially the last section connecting Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., would prove to be one of the more contentious battles of railroads of the particular era. The construction of the Northeast Corridor spans a long period of time, dating all the way back from 1830 all the way until 1917, with improvements to the line continuing well beyond this point. The main reason for this long development period was the fact that several smaller railroads would build smaller sections of this railroad. These would in turn be acquired by bigger railroad companies, mainly the Pennsylvania Railroad, which would in turn eventually own the Northeast Corridor. A good description of the Pennsylvania Railroad at that time was the Google of its day, with a budget that rivaled only that of the United States, and enough capital and wealth available to essentially eat smaller railroads for breakfast. Indeed, the Pennsylvania Railroad had so much wealth, it could literally afford to buy out competing companies and thus take over their lines and integrate these companies into its own system. This method of expansion by acquisition would play a key role in the development of what would eventually be known as the Northeast Corridor between New York City and Washington, D.C., as the company would essentially continue to acquire many of the smaller railroads that existed in this region of the United States, upgrade their tracks, and then link them together into one cohesive system, which would eventually, down the line, it would electrify. All of this power in which the Pennsylvania possessed tended to cause it to project a sense of arrogance with the way it conducted business. And it pretty much is not much of an exaggeration. For example, one might note that the soon-to-be-built Newark, New Jersey railway station for the Pennsylvania Railroad was somewhat modestly, and I say this in air quotes, known as Penn Station in Newark, New Jersey, reminding you just which railroad owned the line that you were traveling on. You may have been in New Jersey, but as far as the Pennsylvania Railroad was concerned, you were in Pennsylvania when you were on their property. Another example is the Pennsylvania Railroad's own competition to the New York Central's 20th Century Limited, its express train to Chicago via its own main line. The myth that surrounded this train for pretty much its entire existence was the assumption that the Broadway Limited, as it was known as, was named after the famous New York City street where most plays took place. In fact, the Broadway Limited's name has nothing to do with the famous street in New York City. The name instead comes from the way, in this context of railroad slang, short for railway, that the train traveled on, which was broad, referring specifically to the 4-track main line that connected Penn Station in New York with Chicago, which the Pennsylvania Railroad had, of course, built and operated. Hence, the train's name, the Broadway, meaning the 4-track main line, Limited. In this case, meaning limited stops giving it express service to Chicago from New York City and back again. And while one might dismiss this seemingly almost arrogant naming convention system that the Pennsylvania Railroad frequently engaged upon to glorify itself and its own name as simple arrogance and over-optimism, the fact was that the Pennsylvania Railroad was one of the few railway companies that could back all of this up, with a massive railway line that was at that time approaching 10,000 miles in length, and the massive profits that went along with it. In short, what the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted, it got. And in the 1870s, specifically 1872, what it wanted was a line from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. This line, once linked up with its recently 1871 completed route into Jersey City, would help the Pennsylvania Railroad realize its true goal, which was a line running from Washington, D.C. all the way into New York City via the ferries in New Jersey. More on this later. There was just one problem standing in its way, or rather railroad company, the B&O, or more specifically, the charter in which the B&O Railroad was constructed under. A charter being a document that essentially describes permissions in which a railroad can construct itself, and other rules in which other railroads in this case needed to follow. Specifically, a rule in this charter that banned any railroad from building into Washington, D.C., paralleling the Baltimore and Ohio's main line, and requiring a gap of several miles between it and the company building said line, essentially giving the Baltimore and Ohio a monopoly in Washington as the only railroad capable of operating out of the city. due to the impracticalities set up by this charter. Quite literally, the first railway company to become operational in the United States, the B&O, or Baltimore and Ohio Railway, developed an excellent reputation even back in these earlier days for its service, reliability, and the comfort of its passengers. And while no one would certainly call the B&O Railroad a 98-pound weakling, as by this point in history the railroad's length totaled over 4,000 miles, it was still not the powerhouse that the Pennsylvania Railroad had become by that point. Now, at this point, most railroad companies would have simply thrown in the towel and simply tried to find a new part of the United States to dominate and or compete in. But this was the Pennsylvania Railroad, and again, the Pennsylvania Railroad got what it wanted, even if it meant having to buy out another company, emphasizing the point I made before. Specifically, a company called the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, which the Pennsylvania Railroad would acquire sometime in the 1870s. Once again, in this time of the Northeast Corridor's history, it wasn't the actual railroad, the B&P itself, that attracted the Pennsylvania Railroad to acquire it, with the railroad's total length somewhere around a few hundred miles. The main reason for this is that the Civil War had begun not long after the B&P had commenced construction in 1858, thus limiting supplies and making it hard to build a railroad in this rough climate. It was the B&P's charter that had gotten the Pennsylvania Railroad's blood racing, which enabled the B&P to build railway lines within the Baltimore and Ohio's territory, provided they didn't exceed 25 miles. Please note, this covered all the Baltimore and Ohio's territory, even Washington, D.C., because of the way the charter was written. With all this in mind, the Pennsylvania Railroad started building a main line running from Pope's Creek south of Washington and continued along easterly, eventually reaching Bowie, Maryland. It was by this point that surveyors realized they were near Washington, D.C., as they could catch a glimpse of the Washington Monument from the right-of-way they were constructing at that time. Once the surveyors had finished measuring the current distance between the line they were working on and Washington, D.C., they found they were 19 miles away, roughly. This was well within the charter of the B&P Railroad, allowing the Pennsylvania Railroad to now build a line running into Washington, D.C., from Bowie, Maryland, which was of course promptly completed. It goes without saying that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad wasn't exactly thrilled with this news. The B&O was most certainly less thrilled with the acquisition by the Pennsylvania Railroad of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, which took place in 1884, at which point the Pennsylvania Railroad essentially banned all Baltimore and Ohio traffic on this line. This would prove a very heavy blow to the Baltimore and Ohio, as prior to this point, both the Baltimore and Ohio as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad had utilized the PW&B to link their individual railway lines to Philadelphia. Needless to say, this was a very controversial move by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This would essentially embargo and leave the Baltimore and Ohio without a leg to stand on, now lacking any kind of railway line to link it to the north. Unable or unwilling to challenge the legality as to how the Pennsylvania Railroad managed to build their line into Washington, D.C., or its somewhat controversial acquisition of the P&WB, the Baltimore and Ohio decided to hit them in the other direction, quite literally. This is to say, the B&O would extend its line all the way into New York City, to compete head-on with the powerful Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, despite how unrealistic, not to mention daunting, this particular task sounds, it was actually a very practical move for the Baltimore and Ohio to make. Nor would it necessarily cost as much as it sounded. To start with, the B&O simply had to have another line running to Philadelphia, as a lot of its business came from this part of the eastern United States. And the idea of expanding further east might open up further opportunities for the company, in terms of freight as well as passengers. To this end, the Baltimore and Ohio then built a new railroad line linking Philadelphia to Baltimore. This new line would also link the B&O with the Reading Railroad, giving the company a huge advantage for its next stage of its project. This new line, which would essentially become part of the Royal Blue Line, as the Baltimore and Ohio would eventually market it as, was completed in 1886. Initially, the new railroad line wasn't exactly perfect, as it required a ferry to be utilized to get across a harbor near Baltimore between the 2 points of Locust Point and Canton. To fix this huge bottleneck, the Baltimore and Ohio would eventually start a new project it called the Baltimore Belt Line that would add a tunnel underneath Howard Street in Baltimore, measuring a total of 1.4 miles. this allowing for the removal of the ferry service, which had become a bottleneck for this line. This line would remain the only electrified portion of the Royal Blue route, as this would be required for the passenger trains to safely traverse the 1.4-mile Howard Street Tunnel. Note the highly unusual method of electrification the Baltimore and Ohio went with. This is, in fact, as you see in the picture, an overhead third rail. This line also included the construction of the Baltimore and Ohio's second station in Baltimore, called Mount Royal. Expansion further northward to New York would actually prove very simple and very practical, not to mention cost-effective. Thanks to the connection with the Reading Railroad at Philadelphia, as mentioned before, the B&O now had access to the Reading Railroad's New York branch, which would in turn give the company a direct connection to the Jersey Central Railroad, who in turn had a major terminal in Jersey City. This terminal at Communipaw in turn gave the company access to the ferries that traversed the Hudson River, allowing passengers to transfer into New York City from this point. As impractical as using a ferry sounded, this was essentially par for the course. Even the Pennsylvania Railroad had to use a similar ferry on the western shores of Jersey to get access to New York City, at least at this point in time. This would of course change in the years coming. And so while at first glance this whole project seemed impractical, if not impossible, it would actually turn out to be a bargain basement investment for the Baltimore and Ohio. And while it's hard to get exact numbers on how much this project actually cost the B&O, it was very clearly at least less than half than what the Pennsylvania Railroad had spent on its line, which would eventually become the Northeast Corridor, between acquiring smaller railroad companies and actual construction costs from New York City all the way to Washington, D.C. The project was also completed very rapidly, with the first inaugural train, even though it didn't go all the way to New York City, commencing in 1890 as the Royal Blue. The first train to make the full length of the run from Washington all the way to New York City commenced around 1895, with the electrification completed on the Baltimore Belt Line. Again, this would remain the only electrified section of the Royal Blue Line, required again due to the 1.4-mile Howard Street Tunnel. From the start, the B&O would find great success with its particular line, mainly thanks to its reputation for passenger comfort and reliability of service. And, much to the Pennsylvania's dismay, began to take a noticeable chunk out of that company's passenger as well as freight revenues thanks to the new line connections they had made into New York City as well as the surrounding metropolitan area. Needless to say, in the tradition of schoolyard rivalry, pardon me, my darn cold is still acting up, competitiveness between the two companies, the Pennsylvania Railroad wasn't going to take this laying down. In 1901, Alexander Gazat, the then president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was getting ever more fed up with the fact that his railroad, much like all the other railway lines operating in and out of New York City, with the exception of the New York Central, who owned the original New York City depot, had to essentially submit itself to utilizing ferries to get its passengers across the Hudson River and into New York City from the west shore of New Jersey. Gazan had attempted to counter this issue initially by building a massive railway bridge in which several other railway companies would share the cost. The price, unfortunately, of this project, which was a daunting $100 million, mind you again, that's in early 1900s cash, would prove too great even to split among the many prosperous railway companies that were originally involved in this group to get this railroad bridge built, and the whole operation had to be abandoned. Gazat, who was again the president of the biggest and most profitable railway company in the United States at that time, with an empire by this point that was closer to 11,000 miles, was not going to allow this to stop him. During his yearly vacation trip to Europe that year, Gazat inspected a new railway station recently built in France called Gare d'Orsay. The most notable feature of this station is that all the trains were brought in under electric traction via tunnels. This promptly set off a light bulb as to how Gazat could get around the monumental cost of building a bridge. Simply don't build a bridge. Tunnel underneath the Hudson River as well as the East River to make a fully functioning station in New York City, allowing for run-through connections via both sets of tunnels, as well as to the north with the utilization of a bridge that would eventually be known as Hellgate Bridge. This whole project, including the tunnels, the before-mentioned span, as well as a beautiful station that would be an artistic marvel, which would modestly be referred to as Pennsylvania Station, aka New York's Penn Station, would cost $50 million. Roughly half as much as the bridge project that had fallen through, but still just as daunting as the bill would be fit by the Pennsylvania Railroad all by itself. In 1910, this massive undertaking was completed, giving the Pennsylvania Railroad direct access into New York City, and giving the Baltimore and Ohio's Royal Blue Line a noticeable disadvantage. As again, any passenger traveling on the Royal Blue route had to take a ferry once they got to New Jersey to gain access to New York. Despite connecting buses that would eventually travel on these ferries to make life easier, this was still far less convenient than arriving directly in the center of the city, giving one walking distance access to various different points of interest. And for obvious reasons, the Pennsylvania Railroad wasn't going to let the Baltimore and Ohio play with its new toy. Utilize its new asset, due to the massive competitive advantage it gave the Pennsylvania Railroad. It looked like the Pennsylvania Railroad system would forever have a monopoly in New York City service. However, this wouldn't last very long, at least in the initial stages, as the United States Railway Administration in 1918, due to the start of World War I, ordered the Pennsylvania Railroad to give the B&O access to New York City's Penn Station via its electrified tunnels. This would continue until 1926, when the Pennsylvania Railroad terminated the agreement, forcing the B&O to revert back to utilizing the Jersey Central's Jersey City Terminal and associated ferries/bus connections, which would in turn give its railway passengers access to New York City via this method. The earliest Royal Blue trains were propelled by steam, which of course was the technology of the day, mainly the 460 variety. Then, as the 20s moved into the 30s, the Pennsylvania Railroad, who also utilized steam power for most of its trains, began to realize that there was a lot of practicality in electric traction for not just service through tunnels, but its actual full-blown mainline power, as the electric locomotives that propelled these trains did not produce the massive amounts of smoke that the steam engines did, and could be turned around much more rapidly due to their lower maintenance. Specifically, the GE-built GG1 Electric would prove to be a long-lived warhorse/speed demon of what would be eventually known as the Northeast Corridor, capable of reaching 100 miles per hour, surviving all the way from its early 1930s introduction date into the 1980s, well into the Amtrak era, and cost less than the steam engines of the day. This would also reduce the need to change locomotives right near New York City, allowing for service to run all the way through to Washington, D.C. uninterrupted. With that, the company began to electrify its line to Washington, D.C. and run electric trains straight through, beginning in the 1930s. And while it is true there were streamlined steam engines capable of making the 100-plus mile per hour speeds in which these trains would achieve, it cost far more to do this with steam power than it did electricity. Plus, electricity was, and I quote, smokeless, meaning it did not produce the noticeable plumes of exhaust which could often make their way into the actual passenger coaches being pulled by said locomotive, making for a rather uncomfortable trip for the passenger. The need to compete with the Pennsylvania Railroad's electric traction would expose the main folly of the method in which the Baltimore and Ohio had built the Royal Blue Line, as the company did not own the entire route in which the Royal Blue traveled. Therefore, fully electrifying the Royal Blue Line from Washington, D.C. to New York would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The Baltimore and Ohio then attempted to use a Model 444 type steam locomotive to help speed the train up, but this locomotive did not meet expectations in terms of its speed or efficiency, and was quickly sidelined. The B&O would also attempt to employ streamlined locomotives in an attempt to increase speeds, such as the 462 Pacific. Unfortunately, they never quite made the expectations or speed requirements the railroad needed, and these were again sidelined. And so the Baltimore and Ohio decided to use a different technology, specifically diesel locomotives, utilizing box cabs as early as the 1930s to pull its Royal Blue trains, specifically EMC's BB models. While these unstreamlined, somewhat ugly-looking box cab locomotives didn't make much of an impression on the public, their successors, the E-units, which the company would begin to bring in to replace them, certainly did. The Baltimore and Ohio would also introduce air conditioning on its Royal Blue Line trains, a real novelty for the time, as while the Pennsylvania Railroad had this, it wasn't consistent. But this would change in the near future, with the Pennsylvania Railroad fully air conditioning all of its streamliners. As America approached the late 30s and the outbreak of World War II, the Royal Blue, like many passenger routes in the United States, would see a huge surge in passenger traffic during this period, with automobiles largely being forced onto blocks due to lack of parts and fuel to keep them running. Indeed, passenger service specifically between New York and Washington was particularly of importance during this period in time, with many elected officials requiring transportation to Washington and back. Among them was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States at that time, who, at least in his civilian life, preferred the Royal Blue over the trains of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Baltimore and Ohio had a good reputation for taking very good care of its passengers. The service, which would be known as the Royal Blue even before the connection into New York City was completed, which would also traverse the new line, which the Baltimore and Ohio would refer to as the Royal Blue Line, featured coaches that were, of course, the usual B&O Blue, but with an actual real gold stripe placed across the top. They were extremely stylish and kept very clean. Interiors also matched up to this, which were Victorian style with extremely comfortable furniture, and overall a very pleasant atmosphere to sit in. A dining service on the Royal Blue, along a common barometer used to judge the quality of passenger service on a particular railway line, was beyond first class. The B&O's colonial class of dining cars featured Dresden china, as well as glass chandeliers, not to mention colonial-style furnishings. With Baltimore and the state of Maryland known for its seafood, many of the specialties served in these dining cars included oysters, as well as freshly caught Chesapeake Bay fish, accompanied by freshly baked cornmeal muffins. When the Streamline era arrived, the B&O would eventually upgrade its coaches to the new lightweight Streamline coaches for the sake of improving speed, efficiency, and comfort of its passengers. Unfortunately, not long after their introduction, the B&O would find fault with these particular coaches, finding that they had a much rougher ride than the old-school heavyweight coaches they used before. In the end, the B&O ended up refurbishing the heavyweight coaches and putting them back into service, adding streamlined cladding to these coaches and giving them a new paint scheme which included light gray, royal blue, and a gold stripe. These said same coaches would remain with the train until it was discontinued. The streamlined lightweight coaches were eventually sold to the Alton Railroad, who would run them in a streamliner it called the Abraham Lincoln for many years. The Pennsylvania Railroad's competition to the Royal Blue included trains such as the Admiral and the Advanced General. Both of these trains, in sharp contrast to the Royal Blue, were full streamlined duties with lightweight cars. A final nail in the coffin, however, would be the 18-car Congressional, which would initially run mornings and afternoons, but eventually have an evening train added on to help deal with demand. In sharp contrast, again, to the 8-car Royal Blue, the Congressionals were composed of 18 lightweight stainless steel cars, which featured much more modern interiors, and essentially made the 8-car train sets that made up the B&O's Royal Blues look like they belonged in a museum and certainly not in daily service. Issues with the ride quality of the 18-car Congressional were non-existent, mainly due to the fact that the Pennsylvania Railroad's electrified line between New York and Washington was maintained to a much higher standard. This was easier for the Pennsylvania Railroad to pull off as it owned its entire line between Washington, D.C. and New York. Not to mention it had the cash to ensure that all the tracks were kept in top shape, where in sharp contrast the B&O only owned part of the line in which the Royal Blue traveled on, and was thus subject to the maintenance practices of the contracting railroads that carried its trains to New York beyond that point. By the 1950s, the Royal Blue became less and less profitable to the point where it began losing money for the B&O, as was the trend in most of the United States at this point, with the automobile catching on, mainly thanks to the newly constructed interstate highway, and with America's fascination turning to the skies, with an abundance of surplus World War II aircraft being very cheaply available to get new airlines started up in a hurry, essentially making flying much more effective in terms of cost-wise, as well as more rapid than traveling via train. This, plus the newly inaugurated bus lines, began to really take a toll on passenger service in general. The Royal Blue was particularly hit hard, as in addition to the fact that its passengers had to utilize ferries to get to New York City, drastically increasing the travel time by utilizing the Royal Blue as to one of the Pennsy streamlined trains. It was also still utilizing the pre-streamlined heavyweight coaches which had last been overhauled way back in the late 40s. In addition to being almost comically out of date, despite the fact that it was kept at a high standard of service, looking like a complete joke compared with the Pennsylvania Railroad's competing 18-car Congressional sets, which again provided a much quicker service between New York and Washington. This equipment was becoming ever more expensive to keep going. As losses continued to increase, the Baltimore and Ohio finally decided to discontinue service between Washington and New York. Passenger service from this point on would go no further north than Baltimore itself. The last Royal Blue train would depart Washington's Union Station on April 26, 1958 at 3:45 in the afternoon. Notable, the last departure of this train was actually televised by CBS in its See It Now TV series. The Mount Royal Baltimore station would remain the terminus for passenger service until it too was closed in 1961. The station and its train shed were subsequently acquired by the Maryland Institute of College Art for preservation. As for the line the Royal Blue traversed, well, it actually remains in service to this day by Baltimore and Ohio's successor CSX Transportation, serving as a main rail freight artery between New Jersey and the South. The story of the B&O's Royal Blue is a story of essentially Goliath beating David, but this is not to say that this particular train was a complete flop. There are many in a small cult following, if you will, that preferred the Royal Blue over the trains of the Pennsylvania Railroad from Washington, D.C. to New York. Notable figures like Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip utilized the train to get back and forth between New York and Washington, as well as United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a frequent guest aboard the Royal Blue. And perhaps the best icing on the cake/last laugh that could be had with this particular story is that the Pennsylvania Railroad, who would eventually merge with the New York Central and New Haven and wind up bankrupt shortly after the merger occurred, and eventually being erased from existence altogether when its remnants, as well as that of several other bankrupt railroads in the Northeast, were rolled into Conrail. As for the high-speed passenger service the Pennsylvania Railroad provided between New York and Washington, D.C., this was taken over by Amtrak, with the line eventually being owned by Amtrak, and eventually expanded all the way up to Boston, where it continues to operate to this day. Conrail would then eventually be split up by CSX and Norfolk Southern, who now operate the two halves of the system as part of their own railroads. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe, and as always, keep the metal side down.